All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we are taking a deep dive into something that's super important for, well, pretty much everyone in India, but especially anyone out there thinking about taking the UPSC exams.
That's right.
We're talking about all those systems India has in place to, keep the government honest,
Mm-hmm.
all those anti-corruption measures.
They're like watchdogs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like watchdogs, making sure things are running fairly.
Accountability is key.
Absolutely. And I think we've all heard those stories, right?
Right.
About government misconduct, and you think, man, there'd be a system for dealing with that.
Right.
Well, guess what? There is.
There is.
And that's what we're diving into today, all those fascinating and, let's be honest, sometimes frustrating ways India tries to tackle corruption.
You hit the nail on the head there. It can be a bit of a maze to navigate, especially in a country like India, right?
Oh, for sure.
With such a vast and complex bureaucracy.
Right. So many moving parts.
Exactly. And all those officials, well, it just creates more opportunities for, let's say, things to go a little off track.
Yeah, opportunities for corruption.
Right. So having systems in place to address all those grievances people have and hold those officials accountable, it's crucial.
It is.
Not just for the individuals who, feel like they've been wronged, but for the entire country.
Makes sense. A healthy democracy needs those checks and balances.
It really does. It's all part of, ensuring progress and development for the nation as a whole.
Okay, so let's break it down. Where did this whole idea of a government watchdog even come from? Like, is this an Indian thing?
Well, the concept itself actually goes way back to 1809.
Wow, really?
Yeah, 1809 in Sweden.
To Sweden. Interesting.
They had this idea of an ombudsman.
An ombudsman? What's that?
It's like an independent investigator. They look
Yeah.
into complaints about the government, try to make sure things are fair.
Okay, so like, if someone felt like a government official wasn't doing their job properly,
Exactly. Or if they suspected some shady business was going on.
they could go to this ombudsman.
Yep. And the word ombud itself, it actually means representative or spokesperson.
Oh, interesting.
So you can think of the ombudsman as like the people's voice, speaking up against any wrongdoing.
Okay, so that's the Swedish model. But how did that travel all the way over to India?
Well, good ideas tend to catch on.
I guess so.
The ombudsman concept, it started spreading, first to other Scandinavian countries,
Makes sense.
but then further afield at New Zealand, the UK, and eventually it made its way to India.
And that's where we get the Lokpal.
That's right. At the national level, it's the Lokpal.
Right, the Lokpal. Okay, I've definitely heard that term a lot.
Yeah.
But honestly, it's all a bit of a jumble in my head.
I hear ya. It can be confusing.
There's the Lokpal, but then there's also all these other things like the Prevention of Corruption Act, the CBI, the Central Vigilance Commission. Where does the Lokpal fit into all of this?
Well, think of it like a toolbox.
a toolbox.
Yeah. India's got this big toolbox filled with all sorts of different tools for dealing with corruption.
Okay, I'm listening.
You've got your hammer, the CBI, that's for investigating those really serious cases.
Makes sense. Hammering down on crime.
Then you've got your wrench, the Central Vigilance Commission. They're keeping an eye on things, making sure all those government departments are behaving themselves.
Okay, I get it. Keeping things in line.
And then you've got your Lokpal. And that's like a high-powered magnifying glass.
A magnifying glass.
Exactly. It zooms in on complaints against those really high-ranking officials.
High ranking. Like who?
Well, even the prime minister, actually.
Wait, seriously? The
Even-
prime minister?
Yeah.
So if I had a complaint about like the prime minister's policies or something, I could go to the Lokpal.
Well, hypothetically, yes. Although it's not quite that straightforward.
What do you mean?
There are some, specific procedures and exclusions that come into play when it's about the prime minister. It's a delicate balance,
I think so.
ensuring accountability while still respecting the unique role of that office.
Yeah, that makes sense. But still, that's pretty impressive. The Lokpal has some serious power then, huh?
They do.
So how did it all come about? Was it always part of the Indian system?
Not quite. The idea for a Lokpal was first floated back in the 1960s.
The 60s?
Yeah. The Administrative Reforms Commission, they recommended it.
So they saw a need for this kind of like super watchdog.
Exactly. They realized there needed to be a strong, independent body to handle those complaints against, folks in high places.
High places.
Yeah. But it took a while for that idea to actually become a reality.
How long are we talking?
Decades. Multiple attempts at legislation, lots of back and forth, you know how it goes. Lots of roadblocks along the way.
Sounds like a bit of a bumpy ride.
Oh, for sure. But hey, Eventually, they got there.
So when did it finally happen? When did the Lokpal actually become, like, a real thing?
The big breakthrough came in 2013. That's when they passed the Lokpal and Lokayuktas Act.
2013.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's pretty recent, all things considered.
It is, and it was a huge moment.
I bet. Finally having this dedicated institution to tackle corruption at the highest levels.
Right.
Okay, so we've got this Lokpal, right? But how does it actually work in practice? Like, who are these people? How do they get chosen? I'm guessing this is where it gets really important for our UPSC folks.
Absolutely. Knowing the ins and outs of the Lokpal, that's crucial for anyone studying for those exams.
Okay, so let's unpack it. Who makes up the Lokpal?
Well, first of all, it's not just one person, it's a whole group.
Oh, really? So like a committee or something?
Exactly. There's a chairperson and then up to 8 members.
Okay, and how do they choose these members?
Well, here's the interesting part. Half of them have to be judges.
Judges. Wow, so we're talking about people with serious legal experience here.
You got it. The idea is to have that strong legal foundation within the Lokpal.
That makes sense.
You know, folks who really understand the law.
Right. They can ensure those investigations are fair and impartial. Okay, so judges, what about the other half?
Well, India is a diverse country, right?
One of the most diverse in the world.
Exactly. And that diversity needs to be reflected in its institutions.
I agree.
And that's what the Lokpal Act makes sure of.
How so?
It mandates that 50% of the members got to come from scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, other backward classes, minorities, and women.
Oh, wow.
So it's not just a bunch of judges in a room. It's a group that truly reflects the whole fabric of India.
That's impressive.
It is. They really thought that through.
So how do they actually choose these members? I can't imagine it's just a simple application process.
You're right about that. It's a pretty rigorous selection process.
I bet.
There's the selection committee.
What's that?
Well, it's made up of some very important folks. The Prime Minister.
Oh, wow.
The Speaker of the Lok Sabha.
Yeah.
The Leader of the Opposition in the Lok Sabha.
Okay.
The Chief Justice of India. And then a jurist, a legal expert who's nominated by the president.
Wow, that's a pretty high-powered group.
It is. They don't mess around.
But they don't do all the work themselves, do they? I mean, surely they're not sifting through piles of resumes.
You're right about that. They've got help. There's also a search committee.
A search committee.
Yeah, and this committee is equally diverse, by the way, and they're the ones who do a lot of the legwork, identifying suitable candidates.
Okay, so it's a pretty multi-layered, thorough process.
Oh, yeah. It's designed to be as transparent and, fair as possible.
That makes sense. So we've got this diverse and carefully selected group of experts, including judges, making up the Lokpal. They have the power to investigate complaints against high-ranking officials, even the Prime Minister.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
That was pretty good, eh?
Bro.
There's got to be a catch.
You remember, no system is perfect.
That's true.
There are definitely criticisms and concerns, areas for improvement.
Okay, so what are some of the drawbacks of this whole Lokpal system?
Well, one of the biggest criticisms is that the Lokpal can't actually initiate investigations on their own.
What do you mean?
They can only act when someone files a complaint.
So someone has to come to them first.
Exactly.
That does seem like a bit of a limitation.
Right. I mean, what if there's wrongdoing going on, but nobody knows about it?
Or what if people are too scared to come forward?
That's the problem. And that's why some folks argue that the Lokpal should have what's called suo motu powers.
Suo motu? What's that?
It basically means they'd have the ability to start investigations based on their own suspicions or, information they come across.
Even without a formal complaint.
Exactly.
So it's like giving the watchdog a little more freedom to sniff around and investigate things on their own.
Exactly.
Makes sense to me. But what about the people who do come forward with complaints? Are they protected?
That's another point of contention. See, the act actually imposes pretty stiff penalties for filing, false or frivolous complaints.
Okay, so you can't just go around accusing people without evidence.
Right. Which makes sense. You want to discourage people from just making things up. But the flip side of that is some people worry it might actually discourage legitimate whistleblowers.
I see what you mean.
Like, imagine you see something really wrong happening, but you're terrified of getting punished if you're wrong about something.
Yeah, I can see how that would make people hesitant to come forward.
Exactly. And that's not all. There are also concerns about transparency, particularly when it comes to complaints against the Prime Minister.
So even though the Lokpal is a huge step forward in the fight against corruption,
Absolutely, it is.
it's not a perfect system.
Right. And that's why it's so important to talk about this stuff, to really understand The Lokpal system, all its strengths and weaknesses and all the debates surrounding it.
Especially for anyone out there gearing up for the UPSC exams.
Oh, for sure. This is the kind of in-depth knowledge that can really set you apart in those exams. Knowing the facts is great, but it's understanding the complexities, the nuances that shows you really grasp the subject.
Right, so we've covered a lot of ground on the Lokpal, but that's just at the national level, right?
That's right. But remember, the Lokpal's just one part of the story.
There's more.
Oh, yeah. Things get even more interesting when we start talking about the Lokayuktas, the state-level counterparts.
Right, the Lokayuktas, okay, so it's like every state has its own watchdog, making sure things are running smoothly at the local level.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember how we said the Lokpal was a relatively recent thing?
Yeah, 2013.
Well, it turns out a lot of states had already set up Lokayuktas way before that.
Really?
Yeah, many states recognized the need for this kind of watchdog at their level, even before it became a national mandate.
Interesting. But wouldn't that mean all the Lokayukas are basically the same then?
Not quite. And that's where things get even more complex. See, India's federal system, well, all that diversity, it plays out in how the Lokayuktas are set up and how they actually work in each state.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Not at all. There's actually a ton of variation. Like, for instance, some states have a two-tier system with a Lokayukta and then an Upalokayukta, who's kind of like a deputy.
Oh, interesting. So like a Lokayukta with an assistant.
Exactly. But other states keep it simpler. Just a Lokayukta, that's it. And the differences go beyond just, how they're structured.
Okay, so we can't just assume that everything we learned about the Lokuk automatically applies to the Lokayuktas.
Right. And that's what makes it all so fascinating. So many different approaches, all aimed at achieving the same goal, keeping things clean and transparent.
Makes sense. So how about we dive into all those differences next time?
Sounds good to me.
All right, everyone, stay tuned for part 2, where we'll explore the world of Lokayuktas and all those fascinating variations across India's diverse landscape.
It's going to be a wild ride. So we've talked about all those fascinating variations, right, in how Lokayuktas are structured and how they work in different states.
Yeah. Like, it's not just a copy-paste of the Lokayuk at the state level.
Not at all. Each state kind of does its own thing, which makes sense when you think about it.
It does. I mean, every state has its own unique context, right?
Exactly. Different challenges, different priorities, and that's reflected in how they approach this whole anti-corruption thing.
So how about we jump into some examples? Like, what are some of the key differences we see across the states?
Okay, so let's start with something pretty basic, who the Lokayukta can actually investigate.
Okay, yeah, jurisdiction, that's important.
Right. So remember how we talked about the Lokpal having the power to investigate the prime minister?
Yeah, that was a big deal.
Well, at the state level, the equivalent would be the chief minister.
Right. So does that mean Lokayuktas can investigate chief ministers?
In some states, yes.
Really?
Yeah, like Himachal Pradesh, Gujarat, they've given their Lokayuktas that power.
Wow. So they can actually hold the highest elected official in the state accountable.
Exactly. It's a pretty strong statement about their commitment to fighting corruption.
I can see that. But what about other states?
Well, in some states, the chief minister is actually excluded from the Lokayukta's jurisdiction.
Oh, interesting. So there's no one rule that applies across the board.
Nope. Like I said, every state has its own approach. Maharashtra, Odisha, the chief minister is not under the Lokayukta's watch there.
That's a pretty big difference. So I guess it really depends on how much each state wants to empower its Lokayukta, right?
Exactly. It's all about how far they want to extend that reach, that power to investigate.
Okay, so chief ministers, that's one big difference. What about other officials? Like ministers, civil servants, that sort of thing?
Well, generally, those folks are usually included within the Lokayukta's jurisdiction.
Okay, so ministers and civil servants, they're fair game.
Pretty much. But some states take it even further. Like Maharashtra, they've included former ministers and civil servants, too.
Whoa, really? So even after they've left office?
Yep. They can still be held accountable for actions they took while they were in those positions.
So no escaping the Lokayukta even after retirement. I like it. What about members of the state legislatures? Are they subject to the Lokayukta scrutiny?
That's another one of those things that varies. Some states, like Andhra Pradesh and Assam, have included their MLAs under the Lokayukta's watch.
Okay, so the Lokayukta can look into complaints against them.
Right, but other states haven't gone that far.
I see. So it really comes down to how much those lawmakers are willing to be held accountable by an independent body.
Exactly. It's about that balance of power, you know?
Right. Checks and balances, essential for a healthy democracy.
Couldn't agree more. Now, how about local bodies, things like corporations, societies? Do they ever fall under the Lokayukta's radar?
I have no idea. Do they?
In many states, yeah. Especially if those entities are getting government funding.
Makes sense.
It's all about making sure that public money is being used properly, no matter where it ends up.
Okay, so that's a lot of ground that the Lokayukta can cover. High-ranking officials, local bodies, even former ministers.
Yeah.
But can they only act on complaints, like the Lokpal? Or can they actually, like, go out and proactively search for corruption?
That's a great question. And again, it depends on the state. But here's the interesting part. In most states, the Lokayukta can actually initiate investigations on their own.
Really?
Yeah.
So they don't have to wait for someone to file a complaint?
Nope. They can act on their own suspicions, information they come across, anything like that.
Wow. That gives them a lot more power, doesn't it?
It does. It's like having a watchdog who's constantly on the lookout, sniffing out any sign of trouble.
I love that analogy. So some Lokayuktas are more like, what, those guard dogs that bark when they see something wrong?
Right.
While others are more like bloodhounds, actively searching for any trace of corruption.
Exactly. Different states, different approaches, but ultimately all aimed at the same thing, keeping things clean.
Love it. Okay, so we've talked about who they can investigate, whether they can be proactive. What about the kinds of complaints they can actually handle? Is it anything goes, or are there limitations?
Well, there's some variation there, too. Some states give their Lokayuktas a really wide range of powers. They can look into not just corruption, but also, general maladministration, any kind of government wrongdoing, really.
Well, so they're like the one-stop shop for any kind of grievance against the government.
Exactly, a real all-in-one watchdog. But in other states, their role is a bit more focused, primarily on allegations of corruption.
Makes sense. Some are generalists, some are specialists. So what happens after an investigation is completed? Does the Lokayukta have the power to punish corrupt officials? Like, can they send someone to jail?
That's a really important point, and it's where the Lokayukta's role becomes more, let's say, advisory.
Advisory.
Yeah, their recommendations, they're not actually legally binding on the state government.
That's so they can't, like, issue orders or impose penalties themselves.
No. They can recommend what actions should be taken, but ultimately it's up to the government to actually implement those recommendations.
So the effectiveness of a Lokayukta really hinges on the government's willingness to cooperate, huh?
Essentially, yeah. And that's why some people have concerns about, potential conflicts of interest.
Right, especially if the Lokayukta is investigating someone really high up in the government, or in those states where the chief minister is included in their jurisdiction.
Exactly. It's a tricky situation for sure.
But even if the recommendations aren't, legally binding, I imagine a really damning report from a Lokayukta could create a lot of public pressure on the government to act, right?
Oh, absolutely. You don't want to be the government that's seen as just ignoring the Lokayukta's findings.
Especially when the whole point is to, fight corruption and ensure good governance.
Precisely. And that's why public awareness is so important. The media plays a big role too, keeping these issues in the spotlight.
Right, because the more people understand how these mechanisms work, the more they can demand accountability from their leaders.
Exactly. It's all about informed citizens making their voices heard.
Okay, so big picture, we've got the Lokpal at the national level, Lokayuktas in the states, all these variations, all these nuances. It's complex, but it's also pretty impressive when you see it all laid out like this.
It is. India is really committed to tackling this whole corruption thing. And that's got to count for something, right?
It does. I mean, it's not perfect. We've talked about all the challenges, but they're trying, they're experimenting, they're adapting.
And that's what matters. It's an ongoing process.
Okay, so to wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listeners, especially those UPSC aspirants out there?
Okay, so first and foremost, remember there's no single Lokayukta model.
Right. Lots of variation.
Exactly. Each state has its own unique approach. So for those exams, you really got to know the specifics of each state's system.
Good point. But it's not just about memorizing facts, right?
Nope. It's about understanding the bigger picture. The rationale behind these institutions, the challenges they face, the debates surrounding them.
Right. This is about developing that critical thinking, that deep understanding of how things actually work in practice.
Exactly. Because ultimately, this is about more than just passing an exam. It's about equipping yourselves to be informed, engaged
Who
citizens.
can contribute to building a better India?
Exactly.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Okay, so folks, stay tuned for part 3, where
Yeah,
we'll see where our deep dive takes us next.
it's going to be good.
Man, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. I gotta say, it's a lot to take in. It's like you start pulling on one thread of this anti-corruption system, and you realize it's connected to everything.
It's true. It's a pretty intricate web. But that's kind of how things work in the real world, right? Especially when you're talking about something as complex as, governance.
Yeah, for sure. And in a country as diverse and as big as India, well, you can't expect a simple solution, can you?
Exactly. No one-size-fits-all approach is going to cut it here. What's important is that India has these mechanisms in place, right? These watchdogs working to make sure those in power are held accountable.
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about good governance, right? Ensuring that
Yeah.
things are run fairly and transparently, that public resources are used responsibly.
Exactly. It's about serving the people, not
Mm.
personal gain. And that's really where these institutions, the Lokpal, the Lokayuktas, they play such a vital role.
They're like those safeguards, those checks on power that can help keep things on the straight and narrow.
Precisely. And we've seen how much thought and effort has gone into designing these institutions, ensuring they're independent, that they have the power to investigate, to make recommendations.
Yeah, it's clear that India is taking this whole corruption thing seriously.
Oh, absolutely. But as we've discussed, no system is perfect, right? There are always going to be limitations, challenges, areas for improvement.
True. There's always room to grow. And I think that's where our conversation today has been so valuable, especially for our UPSC aspirants out there. It's one thing to memorize the facts, the structures, the legal frameworks.
But it's another thing altogether to really grapple with the nuances, the debates, the potential pitfalls, to see how these things play out in practice.
Exactly. It's about developing that critical lens, that deeper understanding of the complexities.
And for everyone else listening, well, it's a reminder that we all have a role to play in this.
I think so.
I mean, we can't just sit back and expect these institutions to magically fix everything.
Right. It's on us to stay informed, to engage in these conversations, to demand accountability from our leaders.
Exactly, to hold those watchdogs accountable too, to
Yeah.
make sure they're actually doing their job.
Could agree more. And ultimately, it's about creating a culture of transparency and integrity, a system where corruption just doesn't stand a chance.
Well said. A system where good governance becomes the norm, not the exception. And that's a vision worth striving for, don't you think?
Absolutely. I think that's a perfect note to end on. So to all our listeners out there, keep those brains buzzing, keep asking those tough questions, and keep pushing for a better India.
And don't forget to check out the show notes for more information and resources on everything we've discussed today.
Until next time, happy deep diving.